Buongiorno.
Good morning. Hospitalization and charity. The case of Granda in Milan. This is the title of this morning's meeting. Granda in Milan is the Magna Domus, the great house, not so much in terms of size, but in terms of quality, because it is the house or home where anyone needing a roof or shelter will be welcomed. It has also been called the glorious hotel for the poor, God's poor. All the names that Granda has had over the years emphasize its importance in the history of Milan, but well beyond Milan. The importance of this hospital, which for a long time, from the late Middle Ages to the early Renaissance, represented an example for all institutions of this type that subsequently were set up all over Europe. Giovanni Testoi, in 1981, when an exhibition was held on the art of charity held in this hospital, he called the institution referring to charity that the Milanese bestow. Francesco Sforza founded the hospital, and with his wife, Bianca Maria Visconti, in 1496, laid the foundations of the building. But Granda was not the first hospital in Milan. It had already been founded in Siena, the hospital that can be considered the first modern hospital, in inverted commas. Santa Maria della Scala, the first hospital to have its own economic and health organization, but it's also a hospital where St. Catherine spent many hours and many long nights praying and in caring and consoling the sick. Santa Maria della Scala was a more important hospital because when Francesco Sforza conceived the hospital in Milan, he called his advisors to see whether they would be inspired by the hospital in Siena. Then Sforza's choice differed. But even before Santa Maria della Scala Hospital in Siena, as many of you will know, along the pilgrims' route in the early Middle Ages, and even before that, that places of hospitality had been founded for the pilgrims, for them to rest and to find succor if they needed it. Places of welcome that over time would form the basis of hospitals as we know them today. But this core of hospitals didn't just exist in those places where anyone could enter and rest. But above all, the core of these places was the humanity of the welcome, the judgment and the vision of the men welcoming pilgrims, aware of the fatigue and the glory of life and death. In those places, this vision of man was experienced, practiced, and expressed in gestures and in concrete actions, which over time were to become what a hospital as we know it today. So, welcome, hospitality, an ability of care made possible by charity. And I'd like to use the words of the main historian of medicine in Italy, Giorgio Cosmacino, who in his book, The Long Art, after a long excursus on the world of ancient wisdom, in which he says medicine was always entrenched, he says it was in the Middle Ages, not in pagan times, in Christian times, that concepts and values of major importance for medicine came about. The concept that the sick person is sick in soul and body, and again the concept of hospitality and welcome. Hospitalitas became a shared commandment as service rendered to the suffering as part of Christianity proclaimed as the religion of the poor. So it was within this humanity that became capable of lived Christianity, which translated into concrete actions and led to the formation of the hospital. Hospitalization and charity indissolubly bound together. This is an historical fact, as we've seen. Or does it also have some relevance today? Obviously, this is a rhetorical question, but it also, in relation to this topic, is the history of Granda, or the Maggiore Hospital in Milan, as it is called today. Its foundation in the mid-15th century occurred, as Cosmacini tells us, when care and charity of many medieval hospitals gave way to the care of larger Renaissance hospitals. Healthcare construed not only as treatment, but also and above all as therapy. A fracture, for example, between a technical hospital and care and treatment that loses the meaning of care in the sense of embracing another person, which is a therapeutic technique in itself. This separation between the technology of care and the embracing of other people, has this been overcome, or is it still today unthinkable to have a true therapy and a true treatment without the two being inextricably bound together? The question of hospitalization and charity, in my opinion, but I think the topic we will be talking about today, evokes not just a historical fact, but also indicates a problem we have to deal with today in the organization and management of health services, or better, services for people, for which health is an abstraction. So if this is the topic, I think that the speakers we have here today is a perfect mix. On the one hand, Francesca Vaglienti, who is a lecturer at Milan University, lecturing in medieval history, and with her expertise and her slides will show us the long history of healthcare, relevant also today. And we also have Giancarlo Cesana, who we know, who for some years has been the president of the foundation that currently runs the Granda Hospital, and is also a full professor in Bicocca University in Milan. And he will tackle the topic, as I mentioned at the end. How can we manage a hospital setting, a scientific hospital today, keeping together what historically risked splitting apart and being lost? Francesca Vaglienti, I'd like to ask you to take the floor.
Buongiorno a tutti, innanzitutto vi ringrazio.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, thank you for your hospitality and for this opportunity to share the history of our Granda Hospital with you. I must say it is embarrassing to be called Francesca and to come to Rimini, as someone said before, but my age lends me to fall asleep reading a book at night. We have our Granda Hospital, which is at the heart of a city which is living an extraordinary moment in its history. In the Middle Ages, Milan was fertile terrain for everything to do with the active participation of the lay population, in everything to do with welcome, reception, and succor and care. This is extremely important because the passage, which will be resumed later, but a layman in exercising his profession can meet the needs and carry out acts of charity. And the better he works in his own profession, so much more can he demonstrate acts of charity, nonetheless remaining layman. So Milan has this vocation of participation of neighbors in helping other people. There is documentary evidence of this. Often we have heard that the average lifespan of people in the Middle Ages was around 25 or 30 years. In Milan, thanks to documents which are the registers of the dead, registers of all the inhabitants of Milan, resident and otherwise, wherever they came from these registers we know with certainty that more than 30% of the population was aged over 70. In addition, there were many people aged more than 100. This tells us something very important, because these people could survive with the difficulties there were and the lack of technological instruments. It means that not only must there have been a high degree of health care and medicine, but there must also have been a network of brotherhood, a sense of collectivity and community, which was quite exceptional. And it is no coincidence that the parish district and the official who had to assess the trend of the population from a social and health standpoint was also a local official, and they were called the elders. And obviously, to be one of the elders and to be elected, it was enough to be over 25, not necessarily elderly. So again, the mixture between the parish as a district reference point, and in any case, a lay official, a ducal official who was acting on behalf of everyone. This important datum means that in Milan we have a multi-ethnic setting and multi-faith setting. First and foremost, the large community of Jewish population living and working in Milan. And under the Sforza and Visconti dukedoms, this was important even then. This first slide shows the part on which what is a quantum leap in experimentation and scientific advances, which was embodied in Granda. In the city republic of Milan in the 1200s, there were many doctors working alongside surgeons with certified professional skills. So unlike what you have always been told, surgeons were not necessarily barbers. They were trained for a school summarized by a school founded by Mondino de Luzzi. So these surgeons knew anatomy and they practiced anatomy. 200 years before Veselio, as we know from history of medicine texts. Among the major examples of Milan doctors and surgeons, important enough to be part of the brain drain going to work for King Philip in France, we have several anatomical tables that tell us that these experts were working elsewhere in Europe. So alongside the spirit of the Renaissance that Professor Bertazzi mentioned earlier, we also have a certain engineering skill. In Milan, doctors were called physicists, which in the Middle Ages meant that they were not practicing the medicine of what was ridiculed during the Illuminist period, horoscopes and so forth. They were doctors who practiced practical medicine, and this meant that they had to be endowed with the instruments to acquire statistical figures, what we now call clinical statistics, in order to understand the evolution of diseases and to be able to recognize and diagnose infections, diseases, viral or epidemic diseases, without the diagnostic tools that we have today. To be able to do this, they needed records, not the classic obituaries that we are familiar with today, what the date of burial and the mother and father's data. But they certified what the person had died of and all the diseases linked to that particular illness leading to that particular death. In order to understand the Granda hospital, we need to understand that the project developed by Francesco Sforza in Milan developed along two parallel paths: to build a hospital, which it was no longer a hospital welcoming patients, but a hospital in the sense that it was a place of care, supplying an organized system of care and flanking patients also outside the hospital. So teachings going from diet to personal care. The first thing a patient was subjected to was personal hygiene and being shown how to look after his own body to keep healthy. So a sort of preventive medicine in addition to health care. Milan had 17 hospitals when the Maggiore Hospital Granda was founded. As Professor Bertazzi said earlier, one of them, the Ruolo Hospital, had 350 children aged between 0 and 3 years. Not to mention the adults. The Maggiore Hospital did not eradicate these hospitals, but it coordinated them, and that was called Major Hospital Maggiore, and it rationalized the distribution of hospitals and started to separate out the type of patients. For example, elderly patients not placed alongside young mothers. Infectious patients were not placed together with children. This is another of the operations that made it possible to better define the development and course of a disease and the treatments that are most effective for a certain type of pathology. For those of you that know Milan, you can see that the locations of the ancient hospitals are also the locations of current hospitals, for example, Fratelli Hospital. The Granda project was entrusted by Francesco Sforza to Filarete, who was a Tuscan planner who opened the Tuscan school and who was also moved from Siena by Francesco Sforza when he sent his engineers to survey the solutions that had been adopted in Tuscany. And this became an example for Northern Europe and became a completely different system based on the quadrangle. As you can see on the slide, that's the bottom part, the 15th century part of the hospital. There are 4 squares within a quadrangle. Francesco Sforza donated the palace and the surrounding area and made them exempt from any taxation, including all the goods that had to be transported to the hospital for its construction. In actual fact, the hospital was built on the strength of charity donated by the population of Milan. Donation means donating everything. I was saying yesterday that I think that Granda is the second most important place after the cathedral in Milan. Anyone doing any major thing would lend some of their time to the construction of the Granda hospital. If it was simply taking water to the workers who were building the hospital, or bring along food, or to build a part of the walls. So the workers, the craftsmen, are Milanese craftsmen in particular, and then we also had bequests, the most important being in the 15th century. This is the diploma by which the Granda Hospital was founded. You know that all care institutions, to be able to start work, they required the approval of the Pope, Pope Pius II, and the foundation of the hospital was approved by Francesco Sforza, and work started in 1446 with the first stone being laid. This is the epigram which has remained. We don't know whether it dates back to the time or was written by another humanist scholar. And this is the layout, the original layout of the 15th century floor plan.
medievale e rinascimentale, tutti gli edifici.
In medieval and Renaissance times, all buildings were polyfunctional. This meant that over and above certain rooms, in this case the room in the cross of the 4 spaces, but each room would be used depending on necessity. So a storeroom could become a shop, or it could become a bakery or a council room, depending on the needs of the body at that time. This applies to the Sforza Castle or any other fort or old palace. The Ca Granda that we see today cost a great deal of sacrifice once it was initially built, and an enormous sacrifice when it was rebuilt after the bombings of 1943 by the Allied forces. The reconstruction done by the architect Giancarlo, who deserves mention because for female architects in that period it was difficult to practice, and her work was exceptional, and reconstructed a whole room from fragments measuring a few centimeters. Everything was reconstructed as closely as possible, as faithfully as possible to the original building, using remaining documentation. The entrance to the Ca Granda is not the current entrance, but was obviously, it followed the wing of the main building in a north-south direction, and it was preceded in Florentine town by an enormous staircase, and this staircase, like other solutions, which even today the choices of architects may perplex us from a practical point of view, and this staircase did not appeal to the stretcher bearers who had to carry the sick up into the building. In actual fact, it was limited in 1638 when 2 staircases were built and then removed to the current entrance. Having said this, it was a very scenic entrance, and again, to talk about the state of the art, you can see that here we have the start of a bell tower, and there was a clock, a mechanical clock, which was put in 1490, built by a Swiss-German clockmaker, so the best available at that time. Here we have the cloister of the pharmacy, and this courtyard still retains the signs of work of the Tuscan architect in the original building. Among the first innovations in Ca Granda is the idea of having a pharmacy dedicated exclusively to the preparation of pharmaceuticals paid for by the hospital and reserved to the sick in the hospital. So patenting and testing and administering medicines in the Ca Granda hospital. And here we're talking about 1470. When the first official pharmacist of the Ca Granda died, the post was inherited by his wife. and to be able to find some way of getting round the forcing the widow to abandon her role, the hospital gave her 3 months before leaving her post. In these 3 months, the widow, who was called Modesta, remarried. She remarried a pharmacist who was accredited, and obviously more than a husband, this man was a business partner. And the hospital supported this, and it is quite extraordinary because we're talking about the 1490s. But Maggiore Hospital had always been very sensitive to the professional and scientific contribution of women. Not only in terms of charity, in comforting and succoring the sick, but also in helping to children to be born. The first obstetric school was born in Milan, in helping nurses to read and write in the 1600s, and to practice as caregivers in a rational fashion, for a simple reason, because the most effective charity is the charity leading to the most effective form of healing and cure. This also explains why the practice of clinical autopsy started so early. In 1473 in Milan, in Granda Hospital, we had what was called anatomy, not autopsy, which was a public procedure, but the clinical autopsy on the people who died in the Maggiore Hospital and had no relatives, so that their death could serve others in the highest conception of charity to save others. Not so much as to know for curiosity, but to learn, to acquire knowledge about disease. The courtyard of the baths, this is hydrotherapy. The first thing that was done to patients admitted to the hospital in the 1400s was a bath. They were given a bath, they were washed and dressed. Each person given a single bed with a feather mattress donated by Sforza's wife. They would be sleeping in a single mattress. If we go and look how our grandparents slept, they used to sleep 4 or 5 together at the turn of the last century.
Una veste candida.
Clean clothes, a beret for their heads, and shoes. This in itself was charity and respect, to give dignity to people who didn't even know what dignity was. So much more so when they were sick, when they are at their most fragile. This attention, this active charity that doesn't make you feel marginalized. For the first time, many people felt themselves to be people for the first time, taken into care with beds made twice a day in clean rooms, with baths for every 2 beds. A latrine, not a potty but a latrine, a bathroom. And Francesco Sforza insisted to Filarete on his design, and he kept saying, what, a bath every 2 beds. We don't have a bath for every 2 beds, even today. This is the courtyard of the ice box. This dates back to the 1600s, another innovative system. This is a mega thermos within which we have snow, which had frozen in the winter, and around this the food was stored. This is the courtyard of wood. These terms don't exist as such. I found them written. This was also the courtyard of women because the 15th century hospital was open to men and women in separate courtyards, but for both sexes. And here we had women and nursing mothers with all the diseases linked to the world of women so that they would be safeguarded. Here we have the great Filarian crusade. Here we have air and other cures, which for the first time we have light and air. The first 2 high ceilings with high windows meant that the room could be aired twice a day, whatever the weather, without affecting the health of the patients who were underneath in their beds with a curtain around them. Each bed separate and private. This is another courtyard for wet nurses, because wet nurses were a professional category. They had to eat in a certain way for the children they were suckling to grow and thrive. And they also had to be set apart when they were suckling the new babies. So they had their own courtyard. This is the great courtyard of honor built in the 17th century due to the generosity of Carcano, who in 1724 donated the sum of 1,622,000 of that era. And it was thanks to him that the hospital space could be tripled, and the second group of buildings that we saw before. A hospital that was another pulsating heart of the city, probably even more than the main square around the cathedral. Look at this picture, which artistically isn't worth much, but painted in 1710, it has been attributed to Sebastione, who was a famous painter at the time, around the beginning of the 18th century. And you can tell from what people are wearing. Look how many people there are in the courtyard. This will allow you to understand how Granda belonged to the Milanese. Mothers could take their children to the hospital because who else could they take them to when they were sick? I don't know if you could see, but at the top of the courtyard you can see a child playing with a ball. And this is something that children don't do even today because it would disturb patients. We see people talking, entrusting their children to care, not always being entrusted definitively, but often for a temporary period for temporary work problems, for example. The hospital of the poor, reserved to those who were poor, who were classified as poor, was so efficient in its health care and treatment that it became the place where the wealthy wanted to be treated, because if there was any hope of being cured, it was in the Granda. So the courtyard of the baths was reserved to the wealthy, and the wealthy had to pay because the wealthy could afford it, and in that way they could ensure care for the poor who could not pay for health care. It was so linked to being a person that not one child abandoned had not just a name but also a surname, so that no one could say that. Then that name Colombo was given to these children. If you think how many Colombo there are today in Milan, and that will give you some idea of how Granda permeates the reality of Milan itself as a city. These are various subsequent views of the Granda hospital. This view in 1821 I like. It's from a Primatzi painting, and as you can see in its reconstruction, Liliana Grassi's reconstruction has respected the spirit of the old hospital. There are treasures which, thanks to President Cesana, that we are trying to add value to, because in addition to what can be seen, Granda is full of hidden elements. Before I was referring to storerooms and warehouses, full of history, brimming with artifacts. This simple storeroom, we have the remains of 3 archaeological sites. The 1431, the one in 1600, and the one of Aliana Grassi dating back to the 1950s. We have drafts, we have half models, we have pieces that have been ruined that need to be discovered and catalogued. And then there is the great human bequest, which is the secret of the crypt, the burial place. All these creatures had stayed in the Maggiore hospital. In the Middle Ages, all the hospital patients had to be buried within the hospital. They couldn't be buried in parish graveyards. But Francesco Sforza obtained from Pope Pius II an indulgence for all these creatures. So from the standpoint of competition, which was also an attraction at the time.
Vi lascio con 2 flash perché sennò sto rubando tantissimo.
I'll end with just 2 very quick remarks. Firstly, a suggestion, that is the Granda hospital was famous for medicaments for the Duke. These pharmaceutical products which were administered exclusively within the hospital. We have beauty farms today, we have spas, we have thermal baths. Anyone inventing creams that are miraculous with a medieval receipt or prescription, I'm sure that they would do no harm. The second thing is a slide on the number of doctors and this is a homage to the poet Carlo Porta. The ratio of the public doctors to patients in 1470 was 1 to 1,400 and more. Let's reflect on this. Are we really in the 21st century? Public medical care was guaranteed to all, and these are very high percentages because we are covering 86-87% of the population of Milan, living in Milan. So even strangers and foreigners who are living in Milan, seasonal workers, anyone in Milan. The dedication, today we talk with horror about Ebola. Think what it would mean to live through the plague. Not just 3 cases, but every year Milan had to tackle cases of plague to stop them becoming an epidemic, thanks to the provisions that were taken and the preventive measures that were implemented. But the cases were always cared for. This is those who were shut in their homes because they were infected were cared for by the Maggiore hospital, who sent food and treatments to great doctors, and I don't know why they haven't had a road or a square named after them. The head of Maggiore Hospital, Luigi da Norimberga, they survived the plague attack of the 15th century with up to 60 dead a day, and they examined all of them, changing their clothes from morning to night to avoid infecting other patients with their infected clothes. In 1480, saints, we have the Camillian monks who were trained in the Granda hospital. But the examples are so broad that we have lay women who sacrifice their own lives to succor children during plague epidemics or typhus outbreaks. And this is the leprosy colony of Milan. The site of Granda and the Sforza Hospital and the leprosy colony has the same labor, the same spirit of assistance, and the same layout for the city of Milan. And in the 15th century, people were healed from leprosy. Let us not be misled by romances of the 17th century, because 200 years went by and they went back. The risk is to go back. Never give up. Never take for granted what was obtained with sacrifice and effort, because then people go back. And the leprosy colony in the center of Milan is now becoming a periphery again. Thank you.
Vaglienti, per questo efficacissimo
Thank you, Professor Vaglienti, for this very effective fresco that you have depicted for us. Not only for the technical aspects, this is charity, thank you. My sincere thanks for your overview, not only of the history, but also the life of this hospital and what it means for the population that lived around and within the Granda, a hospital, a lay hospital, but in which charity was something that qualified the medical profession. And I think this is something very important to bear in mind. Today, Granda is a scientific institution. It's a hospital offering medical assistance and care, one of the top hospitals in Italy. So this means research, technique, science, and Granda gave rise to some of Milan's most eminent hospitals, Niguarda, Sister San Giovanni, and San Carlo hospitals. But Granda is still in the center of Milan and a reference point for so many different health problems. But it is also in the center of Milan, as we said yesterday evening with Giancarlo, it's also one of the main institutions because this charity over the centuries has given Granda land and bequests. So this setting is extremely large, going from the artistic heritage, as we've seen, to the most advanced scientific and technological developments. It is also a central point in the organization of healthcare and in medical practice in Lombardy region as a whole and in Italy itself. Giancarlo Cesana has been its president for many years, so I must say that the history that Francesca has talked about, it is not just something to be kept, but something to be exploited today. How are you working on this?
Far presente come la storia gloriosa che è stata.
I would like to point out how the glorious history of Granda is implemented today and the problems that we have. In a world in which Maggiore Hospital was founded when a national health service obviously didn't exist. It was instituted by charity alone. Now we have a national health service which ensures healthcare, universal healthcare to all, at least for fundamental needs, with an idea according to which charity is no longer necessary. Eliot's words, I dream of such a perfect world that charity will no longer be required. Unfortunately, reality is very different. Today, Granda is a foundation. Foundation means it has a heritage dedicated to one scientific target, and that is research and care in the health sector. I came to nominated by Formigoni, and I am part of a design, a vision, which has, for 18 years, has marked healthcare in Lombardy with the results that all of us are familiar with in the region and in the healthcare sector. So it is in this setting that I have come to the Granda. I was appointed president, and the foundation set up in the in 2000 was called the Foundation of Granda Hospital and Mangiagalli. Because the foundation came from the fusion of two hospitals, the Maggiore Hospital, founded in the 15th century, and the institutes that were from which stemmed the University of Milan, according to the view of the powers that be in Milan in the early 20th century, was to merge these hospitals together. In point of fact, as it was pointed out yesterday, when I came on the scene, Maggiore Hospital was hidden because the meaning of the hospital was concealed. As Francesca said, and as Bertazzi mentioned, the hospital was the topic the newspapers are starting to talk about the history of this institution. So the first step was to change the name of the hospital and return to tradition and to call this institution, this great Milanese work, with its original name, Ca Grande, the great home of the Milanese, trying to resume the words of Francesco Sforza when the hospital was found to build a large hospital for the poor, because the wealthy can pay for their own treatment at home. Now we have a large home for the hospital. The hospital is the hospital of the Madonna, closely linked to the Christian tradition, and as we see, on the 25th of March is the day of the Annunciation. So man has given his work stemming from charity. So first of all, I changed the name. The actions of the foundation to its origin. The foundation was set up by Minister Sirchia and Formigoni with a vision of healthcare organization, trying to make the initiative of stemming from the grassroots to make sure it did not substitute subsequent developments, partly because of fear of the trade unions, and the process was blocked. So the foundation, instead of being a foundation stemming from with a purpose from the grassroots, it became a public institution and part administered publicly like a school or a university, with zero possibility, red tape, blocked by red tape, by bureaucracy, meaning because things in Italy, unfortunately, those who actually take action are persecuted, whereas those that do nothing are not. So the first steps, let me just tell you about the first 5 years. The first steps were to try and put together a group of collaborators, because if we don't have an effective collaborator, then you don't know what's going on. So I needed a person to help me with institutional relations, secretarial duties, relations with the press. I needed someone who could do the accounts, someone who could give me an idea of the situation of health activity, the economic activity, the real estate, and the problem of funding the new hospital. This was a major battle because the public administration requires public competitions. So if the university professor, the baron, takes his own son into the university, he does so because he wins a public competition. So this means that everybody has to enter with a public competition with the trade unions. So it is impossible to do anything, or at least it's very, very difficult. So it took me nearly 7 months for those two people to take those people on board, even though I was the president. As regards the state in which we found the foundation, as Bertazzi said, Maggiore Hospital has this characteristic, which is impressive. From 1496, from almost 6 centuries, it has always been a point of excellence in Europe when Italy was still not on the map of civilization, if you like. Even now, everybody knows about the Center of Hematology in Milan because it's one of the most important centers in the world. The first Institute for Occupational Medicine was created there.
È veramente un ospedale di grandissimo prestigio.
It is extremely prestigious hospital, but this prestigious activity in the average performance and services was diluted to the point that Maggiore Hospital in Milan, if we look at the average, it was 1, just like all of the others. This highlights an economic problem which was immediately noted. The problem with economic problems is that no public hospital can break even because funding by paying the tariff, meaning that hospital services have a fixed tariff for each operation. So appendicitis is paid a certain amount whether the patient stays in hospital for 1 day or 10 days. So this type of payment, this is funding by tariff, pays only 2/3 at maximum of the hospital funding. The rest comes from a whole system which is extremely complex in Lombardy through tariff and non-tariff regimes so that the public hospital can be kept on a mean balance. This affects all public hospitals. We are all hospitals that cost more. For example, San Matteo Hospital in Pavia, which has similar characteristics, costs much less. To give you some idea, before coming to Maggiore Hospital, I was scientific director of San Giuseppe Hospital, a Catholic parapublic hospital, 300 beds and 500 odd employees. This is far fewer than we have in the Maggiore Hospital. And this is repeated in all the Lombardy hospitals. This situation, we have far more employees than we have beds. And it's impossible to keep the situation going without avoiding social protests. Then the real estate activity, we realized that as there was no money for investments, bearing in mind that our commitment in previous years was to build a new hospital by finding 200 million euro. So the only way to do this was to consider the real estate property, look at the rents. So we had real estate to the value of 1,500 million euro in 2009, slightly less now. The income from this was 0.7%. We had 85 million square meters of land, 1,200 apartments in Milan, and we only gained 8 million euro a year, 0.7%. For example, 80 square meters in the center of Milan was rented for 400 euro a month. And it still is, because we have still not been able to change things. And we needed to find 200 million. The state of the real estate, the property, we have 900 portraits of benefactors. We have paintings that are in a safe because they are so valuable. They can only be seen on request. Then we have a church where we have a beautiful Guercino painting. We have the historic Library of Medicine, probably the most important in Italy. Thousands of volumes under plastic in an abbey. because it was raining and the water came onto the volumes, so the books had to be protected by plastic. This is the Historical Library of Medicine. We have an archive with documents dating back to 1100, as Francesca talked to us, with all the activity of the hospital from 1100 to date. We have the cascine, which are historical monuments, usually depicting benefactors. We have abbeys, cloisters, oratories, all going mouldy, located in 95 municipalities in Lombardy. It's all being dilapidated and being ruined because public property is producing even less income than the foundation, 0.1% return on the real estate. So what we did was to try and to see what could be done. It was my first administrative experience. As Andreotti said, I was small, but I wasn't exactly surrounded by giants. So we contacted those who knew most. We contacted the region, the infrastructure office, to see what could be done to find these 200 million euro. The proposal was to launch a financing project to find funds, not by using the heritage of the foundation, quite rightly, because he said it was not the right time to sell, so it would be very difficult to raise the money. We can obtain money from private sources, and then they will grant private companies the use of premises or the task of paying for utilities over the years, and in that way they will get their money back. In 6 months, I gave Formigoni property to rent out. We refused this financing project in the end because after we talked and thought and mulled over the implications, we said that the only positive contribution that we can give to the development and the history of Granda is using its heritage, its assets, which otherwise it's no point in having all this land. Once upon a time they used to cultivate the wheat which was given to the poor or to the sick, but nowadays this doesn't apply. So we set to work, and in the meantime,
l'Achille, che è la persona appunto che è venuta lì per fare I conti, come dice l'Achille,
as my accountant says, lots of observation, very little reasoning. As we went round to contact the real estate world in Milan and elsewhere to try and see how we could make use of these assets, we set up a whole series of actions which aimed to repropose the nature of Grande as it was described. So we revitalized the Feast of Pardon, when the medals were distributed to employees who retired in a feast day with calling in the minister, calling in various celebrities, letting them know that Maggiore Hospital and the maintenance of Maggiore Hospital is like building a cathedral. It's exactly the same thing. it's the same thing as charity. So we restored the one of the works of art, which was under a plastic sheet in a corner. It has the insignia of all the benefactors inside it. Then we launched the masterpiece of Granda. We display masterpieces on a monthly basis so people can visit and contribute and make a donation. We also had the mafia in the administration of the hospital, because 2 offices that belonged to the hospital in the center of Milan were occupied by the 'Ndrangheta, by the Cosco family, the family that killed Lea Garofalo by dissolving her body in acid. Everybody knew this, the legal authorities, the police, the carabinieri. For 40 years they have been in there. In 6 months we evicted them. Thanks, as we say, to the courage of our general director, who for the first time wrote out 58 criminal reports for abusive occupation, for squatting, and with that money we managed to build a new casualty. The abbey in Mirasole is a 13th century abbey, which was built by the humiliated, and a religious order made up of nobles who had been humiliated by an attack on the emperor and sent away, and had set up this abbey, but they drained the marshes, they built this church, they were very competent. But history tells us that one of them tried to shoot Carlo Borromeo, and subsequently the order was dissolved. But for 5 centuries, this abbey no longer had a religious presence. For 5 centuries. In the early 19th century, Napoleon donated this abbey to the hospital as recompense for having taken care of his soldiers. And when I saw the abbey, well, because in 20 years of restoration, 7 million euro had been invested, and when you moved in, there was a terrible smell of mold, water coming through the roof. The copper gutters had been stolen. It was a complete disaster. So at that point, I turned to the Franciscan monks, who have been raising money since the 13th century. So I thought, well, they must find some way of funding this operation. So to find an operation, they decided that they would take on the social aspect, and we would then take on the medical aspect. They wanted to bring in some Romanians, and this went on for about a year. Meetings with the local mayors and so forth. Nobody put anything into this project. But as we say, anything to do with the municipality means it belongs to no one. Everybody just wanted to gain from this abbey. They weren't prepared to commit or invest. After another year, the whole project came to an end. The Franciscan superior said it's impossible, we can't possibly do this. And in the afternoon, on the same day, I had also spoken to Cardinal Scola saying that I've got an abbey here. Can we do something about it? And he phoned me in the morning, Monsignor Descalzi from St. Ambrose rang me up. And they are very stubborn. He phoned me in the afternoon saying, you have an abbey. I have some monks. And he introduced us to some monks of a canonic order, the Premostratenti, set up in the 13th century, of St. Augustine origin. So they are now in the abbey. After 5 centuries, monks have gone back to the abbey. And this is something which is probably a coincidence, because events have a meaning. The license to use the abbey was signed on the day of the anniversary of Don Giussani's death.
Come si dice adesso c'è dentro e praticamente si è rivitalizzato tutto il paese.
It was as if the whole area around the abbey has been revitalized, so that there's interest in a whole series of other buildings in the hinterland, which could be an opportunity for renewing the assets of the hospital. Lastly, we tried to systematically tackle the problem of our assets and our real estate. We took all the buildings in Milan and put them into a fund, a real estate fund, after all contacting all the property developers. We have created a social housing fund so that to find the money to build the hospital from money that is used for social housing with capped rents, together with the government funding. So we should have the first 105 million in cash for them to build the hospital. Then we will restore these properties. We will put in services for the elderly, services for the young, and we will try to protect fragile members of the population, because the hospital has always carried out this social role towards the homeless and to offer a home to those who are homeless. We will also be trying to do this and then selling the more prestigious homes to have another €100 to build the hospital without having to take out a mortgage. And also, if we can ensure a small income by investing in the city of Milan, by restructuring, refurbishing houses, and by extending the hospital. For example, Via Sappi's almost all belongs to Granda, an investment of 340 million over 8 years. It is money on a par with Expo. So we've set up this fund, and all the agricultural land that we own, we have placed in a new foundation that we have set up that is called the Granda Development Fund. So the management of the fund is separated from the management of the hospital, because before, all the money that came into the hospital went into everyday expenses and was not used for investments. Other hospitals do not have the sort of assets that bring in an income. We too want the hospital to work as well as possible in terms of healthcare services, but its assets are an opportunity managed efficiently. There's a lot of work to be done. We have asbestos to be removed. We have rents that aren't paid.
L'IMU, sì. Pagavamo l'IMU praticamente su tutte le case diroccate che avevamo nei terreni.
We were paying property tax on all the dilapidated houses on the lands that we own. So now it took 2 years to prepare this, 3 years to resolve it, pass a resolution, and now from September, October, we will be starting. We will go on till the end of 2015, and we know that there are many that hope that we will leave so that they can start all over again.
Grazie molte Giancarlo.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Thank you for the work that you're doing. As you said, part of the great work that's been done in Lombardy for healthcare at the present time and the future work you are working on. We immediately think of completely different problems than the ones we were talking about before, but if you think they are really, at the end of the day, the same problems, it's important that you have realized that the problems are like this, and in tackling the technical aspects of these problems, we need something that, at the end of this meeting, I would call the intelligence of charity. Thank you very much.